Begins Monday. The murder case made national headlines. In 2014, authorities say Ronald Haskell of Utah disguised himself in a FedEx uniform and pushed his way inside the Stay family home in Spring. Investigators say he was trying to find his estranged ex-wife, Katie Stay, who apparently left him after a string of domestic violence incidents. Authorities say Haskell eventually executed parents, Katie and Stephen Stay, and their children, Brian 13, Emily 9, Rebecca 7, and Zach 4. Another child, Cassidy 15, was shot but survived.
Rowdy Nation TV, welcome back to the channel. Do me a favor, guys. Click that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so anytime I drop a video, you guys can be notified. Let's get to it.
And on the night of July 3rd into July 4th, he broke into an old girlfriend's house and he stole her 9mm gun. Now he had a weapon. All the pieces of his plan were falling into place. And so he continued his drive to Texas while Katie and Stephen and the Stay and Lyons family enjoyed the summer of July. They enjoyed all the things that you think a family would enjoy during that time of year, having no idea what's coming for them. You will learn that he stopped at a hotel in New Mexico and that he began researching each family member, writing down their name, their phone number, their address, plan, intent, motive. And then he continued his drive to Houston, Texas, where he arrived 2 days before July 9th. And he checked into a hotel just 3 miles from the Stay family home. And do you know what he did for 2 days? He stalked them. He followed them. He figured out where they were going, where they came from, where they lived. And not just Katie and Stephen, but every member of Melanie's family that lived in Houston. He watched them in the shadows while they went about raising their family, having no idea what lurked. And so that takes us back to July 9th. Katie hugged her family goodbye at Grandma Lyons' house. They got in the car and they headed back to 7-Eleven Leaflet, their home, having no idea what was waiting for them. They got to 7-Eleven Leaflet that day. You'll hear evidence that the kids began playing in the house, doing the things that kids do. And that at some point, Stephen said, I need to go to the bank. And typically, when he offered that up, several of the kids would say, I want to go because the bank was fun. It was a fun thing to do with just them and Dad. They could get candy. But for some reason, on that particular day, none of the kids wanted to go. But Katie said, I'll go. And so off Stephen and Katie went to the bank. And what you will learn is that Katie told Cassidy, you're in charge. Cassidy was 15 at the time, and it was not uncommon for her to be the one that had to watch out for her siblings. And so off Mom and Dad went, and on that afternoon, Cassidy went into the front area of their home and began playing on the computer like a 15-year-old, right? Playing Pinterest, looking up fun things that 15-year-olds are interested in. And you'll learn that while she was playing on the computer, she heard a knock on her front door. And she went and answered the front door. When she opened it, there was a FedEx driver, and he was holding a package. And what she didn't know was it actually wasn't a package. It was that pillow wrapped in duct tape. But the FedEx driver said, hey, I have a package. Are your mom and dad home? And she said, no, they've gone to the bank, but they'll be back in a couple of hours. And he said, okay, thank you. And she shut the door and went back to playing on her computer. And not 10 minutes later, knock on the door again. Cassidy opens the door. It's that same FedEx driver. And being 15 and with a little bit of sass, she says, look, I told you, my mom and dad are at the bank, and they won't be home for a couple hours. And trying to emphasize her point, she backed up into the foyer of her home and looked towards the clock that was on the wall in her living room, almost demonstrating to him, look, I told you, it's a couple hours and it's only been 10 minutes. as Cassidy is looking over at the clock, she hears the front door shut. And she will tell you that her heart dropped into her stomach because she knew something was really wrong. And she will tell you that she looked back at that FedEx driver and said, "What are you doing?" And he told her, "Hey, I know your mom and dad." And Cassidy, in a flight or fight instinct, reaches within and says, "Oh, that's great. You know my mom and dad. Wonderful. I will tell them that you stopped by. Do you know them from California?" And he says, "Yes, I do. My name is Ronald Haskell." And that's when the light bulb goes off. Because you see, up to that point, Cassie didn't really know her Uncle Ronnie. She didn't have a relationship with him. She'd only heard what Melanie and her family had said about him, and she knew that this was not good. She got goosebumps on her arms, the hair stood up on the back of her neck, and she realized that she was in a really bad situation. But it just got worse. Because he pulled out that gun, that 9mm that he had stolen, and then he pointed at her, and he told her, "Get your family. Get your siblings and take them into the living room right now." And she did. She called all of her siblings into the living room, and being a protective, good older sister, tried to calm them down. You will hear evidence that 2 of the siblings had special needs. Emily had emotional special needs. So she could pick up on emotional cues from people, and if she thought someone was scared or upset, she would pick up on that. And immediately she could tell that there was something wrong with her older sister, and she became scared. And Cassidy put her arm around Emily and said, "It's going to be okay. We're going to be okay." And walked her into their family room and sat her down on the couch. You will hear evidence that the defendant allowed her to put a show on the TV for her family. And so she put a show on for the kids to watch and told everyone, "It's going to be okay. We're going to watch the show, and Mom and Dad are going to be home soon. We're going to be fine." The defendant went and sat on the fireplace mantel so he could see the entire living room. Cassidy was sitting in a chair next to him. Emily was sitting next to her, and the other kids were scattered throughout the living room watching this show. You will hear that Cassidy bowed her head and began to pray, "God, save us. Take care of us. Is this going to be okay?" And you'll hear evidence that when she reached her head up, the defendant took one look at her and said, "So what'd he say?" She told him, "We're going to be okay." But he didn't respond. You will hear that they sat in that living room with Cassidy praying over and over, "When are my mom and dad going to be here? I need my mom and dad here because I'm scared, and he's got a gun, and I don't know what he's going to do." So as she sat on that couch, a short time later, she heard her dad's car pull up. She heard the car door slam. And at that time, you could come into the house by going in a back gate and through the back door. And so she heard the gate open, and she knew her mom and dad were home. And she told her siblings, "Hey, here's what we're going to do. I want you all to stay seated. I want you to all wait. We're going to play a game. We're going to show Mom and Dad how well behaved you are." Nobody moved. The defendant, with his gun, made his way to that back door and was standing on the other side of it when Stephen put his key in that door to open it. And there were glass panes, and Stephen took one look on who was on the other side of his door and who stood between him and his kids, and he panicked. He opened the door, and the defendant told him, "Get inside." He said, "No." He said, "No, get inside." And he pulled out the gun, and he pointed it straight at Stephen's day. And you will hear that Katie was standing behind Stephen and saw what was going on and said, "What are you doing here?" And the evidence will show that she became so scared that she crouched down and actually urinated on herself. That's how scared she was of this defendant. They were led into their own home at gunpoint, taken into the living room with their kids, and the defendant demanded their cell phones and their car keys. They gave him anything he wanted. And Katie told him, "Oh my goodness, your kids are going to be so excited to see you." Trying anything she could to appease this man that's holding a gun to her husband and her family. You will learn that the defendant told her, "I need you to all lay down on the ground. I'm going to tie you up." Now, you'll get an opportunity to see this living room. It's not a very large room. But Katie tells her family, "It's okay, guys. We're going to do what he says. We're going to lay on the ground, and it's going to be okay. He's going to tie us up, and then we're going to be okay." And so they laid on the ground. Katie, Stephen, baby Zach, Rebecca, Cassidy, Emily, and Brian on that floor. You will hear that as they were laying on the floor, Katie looked up. What did she see? Remember that pillow, that duct tape? He had made it into a silencer, and he was putting it on that gun. And Katie, in her wisdom and her maternal instinct, knew what was about to happen and couldn't. She jumped up and she screamed, "No!" and went at the defendant. He pulled the trigger and he shot Katie in the face, blowing out her teeth. And she went down. And then he shot again, hitting her in the back of the head, killing her. Cassidy, laying just a few feet from her mom and dad, is watching this. She sees her dad, she hears her dad get Zachary, the baby, the 4-year-old, and start backing up, trying to get away from the defendant. He's pushing Zach the best he can while trying to get away from this man who has a gun on him. And he's shot in the head. And baby Zach is shot in the shoulder. And he's crying. Cassidy, seeing this horror unfold, can't believe her eyes, and in instinct puts her hands on her head and buries her head in the ground. And she's screaming. And she gets hit in the head. And then she hears the shooting continue. She can hear Zach crying because he's been hit in the
Ronald D. Haskell, the jury, having found you guilty of the capital murder of Stephen Stay and Katie Stay, and having returned a unanimous affirmative verdict to issue number 1 and a unanimous negative verdict to issue number 2, the court sentences you to death by lethal injection. It is therefore the order, judgment, and decree of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the sheriff of this county to be delivered to the institutional division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where you shall be continuously confined until 6 p.m. on a date to be determined, when the proper authorities shall administer lethal injection sufficient to cause your death. State, I understand that there is a victim impact statement, and Mr. Haskell, you may be seated.
and said, "Shh, be quiet." And so she found it deep within herself to stop screaming, and she played dead. You will hear that she laid on the living room floor with her eyes closed, laying as still and as quiet as she possibly could, with her head and her hand burning from where it had been shot just moments before. And she listened. And she heard the defendant's footsteps walk, stepping over her family, and walk to that back door. She will tell you that their back door in the summer would become jammed, it would become humid, and so she heard him mess with that back door, slam it. She heard the gate open to go to the driveway. And then she heard her dad's car back out. It was the quietest that house had ever been. And all Cassidy could hear was a slow drip, almost like water from a sink. She couldn't understand what it was. She finally had the courage to turn her head after having it buried in the floor. And to her horror, when she looked over, she saw her sister Emily. She realized the sound wasn't a sink. It was her sister. Her sister's blood bleeding onto Cassidy, onto the floor. And when she looked around, she saw her family's blood everywhere. And she didn't know what to do. She hopped up. She thought, oh my God, he took my phone. He took my dad's phone. I don't know where my mom's phone is. What am I going to do? And she started thinking. She remembered that her dad, with his real estate business, had a phone, a landline. And so she ran into her dad's room, her mom and dad's room. She picked up that phone, and she made that frantic call to 911. You'll hear it. It's awful. She's screaming, "You need to come help me. He's killed my whole family." And she paces in the house, terrified that the defendant is going to return, but also starting to realize that we may not be the only ones he's after, and recognizing that her grandmother and family are also in great danger. And so when the police arrive, she tells them, he's on his way to kill the rest of my family. You have to stop him. And so as fate would have it, some K-9 officers happened to be training that day. And they were training nearby, and the call went out over the radio. And meanwhile, at Grandma Lyons' house on Anvil Drive, Grandma and Grandpa, Ari, and Melanie were just finishing up dinner. Again, no idea what's coming for them. Grandpa Lyons gets a phone call, and he takes them in the other room, and when he comes back, he tells Grandma Lyons, we gotta go. We gotta go to Katie and Stevens, and we need to go now. And so Grandma and Grandpa and Ari jump in the car, and they head over to Katie and Stevens' house. But as they're en route, they start talking about the conversation, the phone call they got, and they realize the defendant, Ronald Haskell, he's finally making good on the promises he gave. And they frantically turn that car around and head back to the house and run in and throw open the front door and start screaming for Melanie and the kids, get in the car. Don't worry about shoes. Don't worry about car seats. Don't worry about anything. We will explain later. Get in the car. We have to go. He's on his way. And by this point, Melanie has started to realize that her worst fear is coming true, that this defendant has made good on the promise that he made to hurt everyone that helped her. And so she recognizes how bad this is, and she's screaming at her family, let's go, let's go, let's go. And they jump in the car and they head out, not knowing how close they were to encountering him. After he left 7-Eleven Leaflet, he stopped at a Sonic and got a drink, and then started making his way to Anvil Drive. And those K-9 officers who were training nearby started listening to the radio, and they can hear in the officer's voice as they were arriving on the scene that this was a scene unlike any other, that this was really bad. They could tell it from the officer's voice how panicked they were and calling for the number of ambulances they were calling for. They knew. They just knew. And so they go over to the Ponderosa subdivision, which is where Grandma and Grandpa's house was, and they start looking for Stephen Stay's car because they know that that's the car he left in. Deputy Marshall with the K-9 unit will tell you that he was posted up at the end of Anvil Street, and that Ari and Melanie and the kids came tearing down that street. And they encountered him at the end of Anvil. They flagged him down, and they said, you have to help us. My ex-husband is on his way to kill us and the kids. Like, you have to help us. And that K-9 officer said, come over here, and he hides them. And as he does, they hear on the radio the pursuit being called out. And they can hear the defendant coming closer and closer and closer to the house. And sure enough, Deputy Marshall will tell you that as he looked down Anvil Drive, he saw the defendant's car coming towards him. You will hear from Officer Huerta, the first officer that really encountered him, and he will tell you that he put his lights and sirens on in an attempt to stop the defendant, and he refused to stop. Where did he go? Did he lead them on some wild chase to random locations? No. He went straight to that house on Anvil Street. He drove up into the driveway and he waited. He was waiting to see if anyone would come outside of that house. He still had that gun, and at that point, he had reloaded. He was ready. When no one came out of the house, he backed out of the driveway and started driving backwards down Anvil, flipped his car around, and then began the official pursuit. By now, K-9, Precinct 4 deputies have all joined in, and they're all following the defendant as he leads them to his next location. You will learn that he drove approximately 10 miles to get to the next spot. Again, was it a random place? Was it a random house? Was it a random route? No. It was the route that he'd been rehearsing while he'd been in Houston those 2 days prior to the murder. You know where he drove? He drove straight to Melanie's brother's house and wound up in his cul-de-sac, hoping that he could entice him outside. Because at the end of the day, his plan was to hurt anyone that helped Melanie. You will hear that eventually he surrendered. After hours and hours of him sitting in that car, he finally surrendered.
Ronald D. Haskell, the jury, having found you guilty of the capital murder of Stephen Stay and Katie Stay, and having returned a unanimous affirmative verdict to issue number 1 and a unanimous negative verdict to issue number 2, the court sentences you to death by lethal injection. It is therefore the order, judgment, and decree of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the sheriff of this county to be delivered to the institutional division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where you shall be continuously confined until 6 p.m. on a date to be determined, when the proper authorities shall administer lethal injection sufficient to cause your death. State, I understand that there is a victim impact statement, and Mr. Haskell, you may be seated.